As the fallout around the Lance Armstrong doping scandal continues, we ask, will cycling ever be clean from the doping culture? And what impact will the Armstrong controversy have on the fight against performance-enhancing drugs in sport? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Seeker. Well, the fallout from doping allegations against Lance Armstrong continues as the sportswear maker Nike decided to end its long-standing endorsement deal with the former cyclist. And it's going to cost him. The deal was reported to be worth about $7.5 million a year. Nike last week pledged to continue to support Armstrong, but now says it was misled by the American cyclist for more than 10 years. After Nike's decision to cut him loose, 3 more of his sponsors followed suit. Armstrong himself has also stepped down as chairman of his cancer charity, Livestrong. These developments came in the wake of the U.S. anti-doping agency's report into his case last week. The agency said it has considerable evidence that Armstrong had used performance-enhancing drugs for several years. In August, the former cycling champion was stripped of his 7 Tour de France titles and banned from cycling for life. We'll talk more about the implications of all this in just a moment, but first let's take a closer look at how we got here. Lance Armstrong was charged with doping offences in June. In July, Armstrong tried to block the US anti-doping agency case by filing a federal lawsuit against it. But he dropped it 1 month later when he announced he would give up his fight against doping allegations. The US anti-doping agency banned Armstrong from cycling for life and stripped him of his 7 Tour de France titles. And last week the agency said it has overwhelming evidence that Lance Armstrong and his former US Postal Service cycling team ran sport's biggest doping conspiracy ever. The report, about 1,000 pages long, includes testimony from 26 people, 11 of whom are Armstrong's former teammates. Unfortunately for the sport of cycling, Lance Armstrong's case is just one of a number of doping stories that have hit the headlines. Here are some of the most recent ones. This month, the former Australian cyclist Matthew White quit as director of an Australian pro cycling squad after he said he was involved in doping while riding with Lance Armstrong's US Postal Service team. Also in October, the US anti-doping agency announced the American professional road cyclist Christian Vande Velde would be suspended for 6 months for doping during his time also with the US Postal Cycling team. In August of this year, Jonathan Vaughters, the former US professional racing cyclist and current manager of the Garmin Sharp professional cycling team, has admitted he was taking drugs during his cycling career. And in 2010, retired American cyclist Floyd Landis was stripped of his 2006 Tour de France title after admitting to doping. So will cycling ever be clean from the doping culture? Well, to help us answer this question and a whole lot more, we hope, we are joined by our 3 guests in London. Richard Moore, Scottish journalist and author. Mr. Moore is also a former racing cyclist. In Glasgow, Alan Ferguson, managing director for the sports business. And also in London, Mihir Bose, sports author and a former sports editor for the BBC. Good to have you all with us, gentlemen. Richard Moore, if I could start with you, what impact do you think this entire story is going to have on cycling fans and on the future of the sport?
Well, as we're seeing, it's having a huge impact. It's been a story that's been building up for years and years. I mean, the best part of a decade, people have had their suspicions about Lance Armstrong. The mistake that the sport made was to ignore those suspicions. 1 or 2 journalists wrote about the suspicions, found some evidence, but a lot of journalists were also very limited in what they could write. And at a point when the governing body should have taken a lead and taken this evidence a little bit more seriously, they chose to ignore it, it seems now. And I think the sport is paying the price for that, as we're seeing at the moment.
Mihir Bose, to what extent is the people who run cycling to blame for this culture of systematic doping?
Well, they have a lot of responsibility. They run their sport. They say they're self-governing, autonomous. They can run their sport. Remember, this is what may be called the second battle over cycling. It was back in 1998 when cycling was exposed by the French police with drug taking, and that led to the setting up of the World Anti-Doping Agency. And the United States Anti-Doping Agency is, if you like, a child of the World Anti-Doping Agency, set up many years later. This is the second phase of the battle. So cycling can't say we were not aware of it. It has been going on, as Richard said, for years, and not years. It's been going on for almost 2 decades.
Why do you think it has been going on that long?
It has been going on because, of course, Lance Armstrong has got away with it. Richard has mentioned some journalists who pursued him had to, because of the libel laws we have, particularly in Britain, which are rather weak, have had to pay libel damages, the Sunday Times in particular. And secondly, the cycling authorities themselves haven't woken up to it and said, there is a problem here. They have all the time said, oh, there is no case to be proven, no case to show, there is nothing to investigate, and they haven't set up, if you like, their own regulatory bodies which have investigated this, or at least acknowledged that if there is so many allegations being made, so many stories, maybe all this smoke means there's a bit of fire. And what we have now found is a raging inferno.
Alan Ferguson, as someone who's involved with the marketing side of sport, I want to ask you what you think was really behind Nike's decision to part ways with Lance Armstrong, because they initially stood by him quite firmly, and now they've done this about face, it seems. Does that not strike you as slightly disingenuous?
Well, I think they've shown a degree of belated bravery, but in August they defended Lance Armstrong very strongly when the stripping of his 7 Tour de France titles was called for, and only last week when USADA produced the 1,000-page report. When you then publish less than a week later a 2-paragraph statement which contains the line, "We have been misled for over a decade," that's a very powerful corporate statement, and I think speaks volumes for the disappointment within Nike that they feel over their continued support for Armstrong.
Do you think that they should have not seen the warning signs earlier? I mean, are they just bowing to public pressure, to the not wanting to seem to be continuing to have this commercial deal with him? Well,
we all have 20/20 hindsight, but you must remember that Nike's support was not for Lance Armstrong, the competitive cyclist per se. It was for Lance Armstrong, the myth, and the cancer survivor and the cancer champion. And through the Live Strong charity campaign and all the merchandise that they created around that was Live Strong. It wasn't an endorsement by or for Armstrong, but everybody associates the two. So while he was riding for US Postal under this doping cloud, they weren't directly supporting him, they were supporting his kind of off-road activities. But you know, they are so emotionally and visibly wound up in Armstrong that they are seen to be his major sponsor. So it's very embarrassing for them, and some would argue, many would argue, that they should have done this a long time ago.
Richard Moore, I want to go back to where the International Cycling Unions should have stood on this, because if we look at that report by the US Anti-Doping Agency, it is so detailed and so extensive that it begs the question, how could the leading cycling officials, those most familiar with the sport and its riders, not have been aware of the nature and the extent to which their sport was being compromised?
Well, you'll forgive me for giving quite a long answer to this, but as Alan suggested, 20/20 hindsight is marvellous, but we can see now that Lance Armstrong emerged in the mid-1990s, early to mid-1990s, at a time in the sport when the EPO, the blood booster, was starting to be used. There was no test for EPO. The World Governing Body's response to their suspicion that its use was rampant in the professional peloton was to introduce what they called a health check, which effectively allowed riders to use EPO up to a certain level. And so you can see how the doping then became systematic. Guys who were using EPO were riding and winning. Guys who were not using EPO could not keep up. So doping became systematic. It was semi-authorized by the UCI, the World Governing Body. Hein Verbruggen, who was the president of the UCI at the time, always claimed that EPO wasn't a problem. Anyone who came out and spoke out about it, there were a couple of riders, including Graham O'Brien, and Gilles de Lyon, a French rider, who both came out and said in the mid-90s that there was a huge drug problem in cycling. They were dismissed by Hein Verbruggen as being bitter people who hadn't made it in the sport. And I think the problem was conveniently ignored for a long, long time. Lance Armstrong, when he re-emerged in 1999, having overcome cancer, he took to the start of the Tour de France the year after the Festina scandal, as Mihir mentioned, brought the sport to its knees and almost destroyed that year's Tour de France. Following that, there were some teams and some riders who were very keen to change, and some teams did change. And we had, following 98, what we called cycling at two speeds. There were teams who were not doping anymore, and there were teams who still were doping. And it all makes perfect sense now. I mean, Lance Armstrong, the myth, began in 99 when he won the first stage of the 99 Tour and took the yellow jersey and tested positive for cortisone. He was allowed on that occasion to produce a backdated prescription, which exonerated him. In fact, he should have been punished for that. He should have been thrown off the race and banned. And that would have ended the Lance Armstrong story right there and then. But it was ignored, and he was given special dispensation. The USADA report suggests that he may also have had other protection over the years from the governing body. And he became almost too big to bring down, too big to fail, if we want to use the terminology we used for banks as well. He became bigger than the sport. The sport needed him more than he needed the sport, and that really is where we've ended up today. It's a mess.
You share that view, Mihir Bose, that the myth surrounding Lance Armstrong became too big for the people who run cycling to really want to deal with him?
Well, Richard has analysed this very well. There are two issues here. The first issue is that in sport, when you have doping, the person caught never admits to doping. Look at Ben Johnson. Ben Johnson, and Richard has written about this himself in a very good book. Ben Johnson never admitted to doping for a long time, didn't, and even claimed to this day, I think, that the actual one which caught him in Seoul was a faked drink. And the other problem, and this goes back to the earlier point that was made about backers and, commercial backers, that they cop out. They look at sport and they see, oh, well, we want a role model there. We want somebody who is pure. So Armstrong came just after cycling had had its first major check, when everything seemed was full of holes, when cyclists were considered to be all dope addicts. Here's an American who comes along, wins in a sport where Americans don't win, and who is then portrayed as the great role model to be taken. And this is a cop-out on the part of the sponsors. They do not do enough in terms of checking. They do not do enough in terms of corporate governance, the sort of corporate governance we expect in other institutions. Do they prove themselves? They don't do that. They accept the word of the sport, and frankly, what this whole thing shows is that sport is incapable of on its own governing itself. It needs external bodies like the United States Anti-Doping Agency, or like in 1998 the French police coming in. And this is the tragedy of sport, which has been going on for a long time, and Armstrong exposes it again.
All right, let's put some of that to Alan Ferguson then. Do you think that the sponsors bear some responsibility here? I mean, as someone who deals with sponsors in your line of work, do you think that for too long that they have turned a blind eye to this sort of thing?
I don't know that they turn a blind eye, but if you take the case of Nike, here was a man, Armstrong, who was diagnosed with cancer, which went to the brain, and within 18 months was back in the saddle. And from a brand point of view, it kind of fitted with Nike's whole ethos: just do it, be all you can be. Through determination and drive, you can succeed. They began to fund the cancer charity, not necessarily, I'm not being disingenuous, but not necessarily Armstrong, the road cyclist. But that kind of fitted with their whole brand proposition. But the danger of celebrity endorsement, as Nike have found with Tiger Woods, luckily Roger Federer is Mr. Clean, and Michael Jordan seemed to live a reasonably decent life. If the celebrity you endorse goes off the rails, your brand is damaged and your whole corporate ethos is challenged. And they have stockholders in America that they have to account to. They have customers all over the world. They're a hugely influential street brand. They do influence many, many young people. But if you're a 15 billion US business, you will have to take a commercial view of those endorsements you make. Tiger Woods is vitally important to them. Their whole golf proposition is built on woods. Clothing, equipment, footwear, and he still gets paid somewhere between $35 and $40 million a year. But he got to #1 in the world through ability, not through enhancement by drugs. His misdemeanors were personal. His infidelity was down to him. His position as a sportsman wasn't challenged by the supplementing of drugs, etc. But Mihir is right. He touched on 2 points there. I think that many sponsors do turn a blind eye to, and I think we're now reaching a tipping point in the sports marketing world where more is demanded. Sports sponsorship and investment in sports marketing is a massively expanding and growing business, and with that comes responsibility. And when companies transfer their own brand image and brand values to an investment, they have to be very, very aware of the role that they're playing, because many people will take the endorsement by the brand as being very powerful in how they view the athlete or the activity or the team. And I do think when you see Team Sky this morning coming out and demanding a code of conduct, that could be very, very illuminating in terms of who. Nobody's going to say yes, they doped in the past, but to protect their own brand image as a very successful television business in the world, they have to put a marker down.
Indeed. Let's put that point to Richard Moore about the fact that you are seeing teams and corporate sponsors now perhaps taking a closer look at this side and how it affects their brand. I mean, Alan used the example there of Team Sky demanding that their cyclists sign this piece of paper that says that they have never doped and they will never dope. Do you think that's the right way forward? I mean, it does seem that cycling has reached a critical juncture here.
Cycling is at the vanguard of this in a way because it's the original commercial sport. You know, companies give their whole name to a team. You don't have a Manchester United, you've got a Team Sky. You know, the team is known as the sponsor. So there's this very, very close association, which has always been the way cycling has run. And I think that in a way offers hope to cycling, that when sponsors actually demand a certain code of conduct or whatever you want to call it, that could be the thing that saves cycling. But there are 2 points. I mean, there's a danger in applying the 2012 morality to a previous era. And I think it's extremely difficult to find ex-riders who rode in the 90s who were not involved in some way in doping. It was systematic. What's more, it wasn't regarded as cheating. I mean, nobody really cared about doping in the 1990s. We'd had the Ben Johnson scandal in 1988, but there was no World Anti-Doping Agency. Sports were policing themselves.
So you think it was more a culture of these guys are all doing it, so, and if I want to compete, I don't want to be left behind?
They didn't think they were cheating. Riders who competed in the 90s in teams were just being professional. They were doing their job. They didn't regard it as cheating. And they were encouraged not to think it was cheating by the governing body, who, as I said, imposed what they called a health check. If you failed the health check, you sat out racing for 2 weeks, but it wasn't regarded as a doping positive. And so there's been this huge shift in the public attitude, in our attitude since then, and especially since the formation of the World Anti-Doping Agency, especially since the Festina scandal. You know, anyone who cheated after '98 very, very much knew that it was wrong, even though there wasn't yet a test for EPO that came along a couple of years later. And the attitudes towards it have changed over the past few years, and there's a very different attitude towards it now. And in cycling, since 2006 and the second major scandal, Operation Puerto, it's become, the culture has changed. There was a culture of doping, and now there is a culture of anti-doping in the sense that a lot of riders are not afraid to speak out about the subject where previously they were. And so the culture has changed. It's happened very, very gradually. It's still ongoing. But there is a danger, I think, in, as I say, applying this 2012 morality to a previous era. I mean, you could go back through the history of cycling, and Fausto Coppi, Eddie Merckx failed drugs tests. All the great champions were involved in some way in drug taking. It was part of the sport, and it wasn't regarded by them as cheating, and it wasn't regarded by the media as cheating or by the governing body as cheating.
Mihir Bose, are you confident that cycling will learn from this, or are you pessimistic?
I'm rather a pessimist. I agree that our attitudes towards what is acceptable and what is not acceptable has changed. But that is true of in life in general. You read about our politicians in the past. They had infidelities and nobody cared about them. You read about what Jack Kennedy got up to. And when he was alive, all these things were not discussed. But what has changed, and this is what we need to be careful about, sport is now considered to be part of the validation of a nation. When Rio got the Olympic Games, the one after London in 2016, President Lula of Brazil cried. Qatar is celebrating because it's got the World Cup. If sport is that important, London, for instance, had a wonderful Olympic Games and everybody thought this was a feel-good factor. If sport can uplift a nation, then it's incumbent on sportsmen and sportswomen to have a certain standard, and it's incumbent that we exercise a certain level of scrutiny and make sure they come up to that standard. And that is not hindsight, that is not 2020 vision, that is a necessary thing, because we cannot make them role models and find that they have feet of clay or they are enmeshed in the worst kind of behavior, which is what we are seeing with Lance Armstrong. And my worry is that sports administrators are still reflecting an era that is long gone. They feel their sport is autonomous, they feel they can control their own sport, they can police their own sport, and then the wrongdoing is not discovered by them or by their own machinery. The wrongdoing is discovered by government agencies, by regulatory bodies, and when that comes up, they are baffled, surprised, they go into a defensive shell. And I haven't seen enough evidence to show that these sports organizations are capable of showing the sort of corporate governance that I think we demand from our other institutions. And once these sports organizations are recreational bodies, side time activities, it didn't matter. Now they are big sporting corporations earning lots of money from sponsorships, and they need to show a sense of responsibility. And so far, cycling at least has not shown that sense of responsibility.
Alan Ferguson, when you talked earlier about the need for more responsibility from corporate sponsors, in the way that they invest in athletes and in their sports, something like that is going to have a bigger impact on cycling. Is it because isn't that a sport that is, because it's a niche sport, it's far more dependent on commercial sponsorship than, say, many other sports like football, team sports and so on, where the revenues come from lots of other different sources?
Yeah, I think cycling appears to be more dependent on commercial funding. They have no admission revenues. You can't charge someone to stand at the side of the road. But I do think it's maybe, there is a tipping point perhaps in cycling now, and hopefully it cascades into the rest of sport. And it may well be, as Richard said, that an amnesty has to be called on riders who operated in an area of what was accepted practice and then move forward. But to take a broader view across all of sport, Mihir touched on corporate governance and self-policing. And I think that as more money comes in from huge brands all across the world, corporate governance to match that of the brands will be demanded. Because a brand wants to enjoy the benefit of association with a particular sport, and they align their brand values with a standard that they expect from the sport. And I'm not suggesting that sponsorships begin to interfere with sport, but maybe in that area that they will rise up and lift sports up. But I think that sports should be fearful that perhaps local governments will start to impose legislation on the sport, and the courts will begin to run the sports and not allow the freedom of self-policing that many sports enjoy. It was only, I think, the US Postal Service as a federal agency challenged Armstrong by saying you misled a federal agency, that led to some kind of federal investigation which fell apart. But I think as sports sponsorship grows in value, more and more sponsoring companies will demand higher standards of corporate behaviour.
Do you think that's the way things will go, Richard Moore, that people, coming from the sponsors to the people who run the sport, will demand better behaviour, if I can put it that way?
Yeah, I think, and ironically, I think cycling is in quite a strong position. The corporate sponsors, where in the past have perhaps not been a positive influence, now have the opportunity to exert a positive influence, no pun intended, because their reputations, their brands are at risk if they align themselves with cycling, and so they can impose upon the riders, as Team Sky are trying to do now with some challenges, I would suggest, are trying to impose a very strict code of conduct on the riders and on the team. And the great PR to be had in cycling now is to be running a clean team. I mean, there's a team, Garmin, who have very successfully presented themselves as an anti-doping team.
That is going to have to be
proved to be a very positive.
That is going to have to be the last word. I want to thank all three of our guests in London: Richard Moore, in Glasgow, Alan Ferguson, and also in London, Mihir Bose. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. Remember, if you want to send us your feedback, just email your thoughts to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. For everyone here, I'm Hazem Sika. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.